Germany didn't lose the war because its tanks broke down. It lost the war because it finally understood who it was fighting. In the middle of winter, German soldiers reached an abandoned American fuel depot, row after row of fuel cans, enough to move tanks, trucks, and guns again, enough to feel hope. But that hope lasted only minutes. The fuel wasn't hidden, it wasn't protected, it wasn't even destroyed, it was simply left behind. That was the shock. Germany treated fuel like gold. Every drop was counted, every move depended on it. The Americans treated fuel like clutter. If they needed to deny it, they burned millions of gallons without hesitation. That single discovery revealed a terrifying truth. Germany was not fighting an army that feared shortages. It was fighting a system that could waste more in a day than Germany could produce in months. From that moment on, every German advance was meaningless. Even success led nowhere. One side planned battles around scarcity. The other planned wars around excess. When soldiers realize their enemy can afford to destroy what they are desperate to steal, the outcome is no longer decided by courage or skill. It is decided by scale. And scale does not change on the battlefield. It is built years before the war even begins. From the very first hour of the offensive, the German plan revealed a quiet but fatal assumption. This attack was never designed to be sustained by German supply. It was designed to survive by stealing from the enemy. Fuel was not secured before movement. It was expected to be found along the way. Every kilometer forward increased dependence on American abundance. The Ardennes offensive was not built on logistics, it was built on faith that the enemy had more than Germany lacked. German commanders understood the problem clearly, even if they did not admit it openly. Orders issued before the advance were unusually restrictive. Engines were to be shut down during every halt. Tanks were instructed to move in narrow columns, not for tactical flexibility but to conserve fuel. Any delay longer than a few minutes became dangerous not because of enemy fire but because idle engines meant wasted gasoline. Combat power was no longer defined by armor thickness or gun caliber. It was defined by how long a vehicle could remain running. At the operational level, the weakness was even clearer. The distance to the Meuse River exceeded the fuel allocated to reach it. The plan compensated for this gap with a single assumption: American depots would fall intact. German forces would advance from one captured supply point to the next, refueling as they went. Success depended not on defeating the enemy, but on the enemy fleeing quickly and leaving everything behind. The offensive required American retreat to function. That alone exposed the imbalance. This dependency reshaped German decision-making. Tactical priorities shifted. Positions that should have been bypassed were attacked because they guarded fuel. Delays that should have triggered alternative routes were accepted because turning back burned more fuel than pushing forward. Even discipline changed. Commanders who once emphasized maneuver and firepower now spoke constantly about consumption rates. War was being reduced to arithmetic, under pressure. Meanwhile, across the front, American units operated under a completely different psychological reality. Fuel was not a limiting factor. It was a background constant. American logs recorded multiple fuel deliveries per week, sometimes per day. Supplies arrived faster than they could be distributed. Storage tanks filled, while trucks were still unloading previous shipments. Officers did not calculate whether they could afford to move. They calculated how fast they wanted to move. This difference shaped behavior in subtle but decisive ways. American vehicles idled freely during halts. Engines ran to keep crews warm. Trucks waited with motors running because efficiency mattered less than readiness. When threatened with capture, American engineers destroyed fuel without hesitation. Burning thousands of gallons was not seen as loss. It was seen as denial. The assumption was simple: more would arrive tomorrow. The German command observed this behavior with disbelief. To them, fuel represented survival. Every drop carried the weight of months of production, bombing losses, and transportation bottlenecks. Fuel production had already been crippled. Synthetic plants operated under constant air attack. Aviation fuel shortages, grounded aircraft. Training was cut. Naval operations slowed. Even civilian life had adapted to scarcity. By late 1944, fuel scarcity was not a temporary problem. It was a permanent condition. The Ardennes offensive attempted to ignore that reality rather than solve it. Instead of rebuilding logistics, the plan bypassed them. Instead of matching American production, it aimed to exploit American abundance. This created a paradox. The more fuel Germany needed, the more it depended on an enemy capable of wasting fuel freely. Every captured depot confirmed not German cleverness but German vulnerability. As the advance continued, the imbalance grew impossible to ignore. Traffic jams formed on narrow roads, not because of enemy resistance, but because vehicles designed for different theaters consumed fuel inefficiently in difficult terrain. Each delay burned irreplaceable resources. Every detour increased consumption. When German columns stalled, American units did not panic. They waited. They resupplied. They prepared counterattacks, knowing fuel was not the limiting factor. The battlefield itself became a demonstration of two economic systems colliding. One side fought with machines it could barely afford to move. The other fought with machines backed by pipelines, truck convoys, and refineries operating at scales beyond European comprehension. The German plan treated fuel as treasure to be captured. The American system treated fuel as flow, continuous and replaceable. By the second day of the offensive, the truth was already visible. German units advanced faster on maps than in reality. Fuel consumption exceeded optimistic projections. Captured supplies barely kept pace with losses. The offensive moved forward physically while collapsing mathematically. Even victories accelerated failure because each mile gained required more fuel than the last. The Ardennes was supposed to be a decisive gamble. Instead, it became a slow revelation. Not of tactical inferiority, but of structural impossibility. The German army was attempting modern, mechanized warfare without the industrial foundation required to sustain it. The Americans were not simply fighting better. They were fighting on a scale where loss could be absorbed, burned, or ignored. Before the first major defeat, before encirclement, before retreat, the outcome was already written into fuel tables and delivery schedules. The war had reached a stage where courage and experience could no longer compensate for imbalance. The offensive had not yet failed on the ground, but it had already failed in reality. The next acts would not change that truth. They would only expose it more clearly. The illusion of momentum shattered the moment the German column reached its first major prize. The fuel depot was real. The cans were full. The engines could run again. For a brief window, the gamble appeared to work. Vehicles refueled. Columns moved forward. Radios crackled with renewed confidence. But that moment of relief exposed something far more dangerous than shortage comparison. This was not fuel captured after hard fighting. It was fuel abandoned, left intact, left in quantities that felt careless. And that detail changed everything. German officers began to understand that the problem was not whether fuel existed, but how it was valued. For Germany, fuel represented effort, risk, and vulnerability. It came from fragile synthetic plants, bombed rail lines, and rationed allocations. Every gallon carried strategic weight. For the Americans, fuel appeared to be part of the environment. It arrived continuously, predictably, and in volumes that allowed destruction without hesitation. That contrast transformed success into dread. As German vehicles consumed the captured fuel, new evidence accumulated. Paperwork left behind revealed supply chains that stretched across oceans yet operated faster than German internal transport. Newspapers dated only days earlier spoke casually of new pipelines, new depots, new capacity. This was not emergency resupply. It was routine. The realization spread quietly through the ranks. What they had captured felt miraculous only because they had never seen the scale their enemy considered normal. Then came the fires. German units pushed deeper. American engineers began destroying their own fuel dumps in advance of capture. Entire fields of gasoline burned. Flames rose high enough to be seen miles away. Black smoke columns marked locations where fuel had existed in quantities beyond German planning assumptions. These were not small depots. They were reserves measured in millions of gallons. Fuel destroyed not in panic but by order. For German commanders watching from a distance, the message was unmistakable. The Americans could afford to burn more fuel in a single denial operation than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. What had seemed like a logistical victory now appeared meaningless. Capturing 50,000 gallons no longer felt decisive when millions were being erased without hesitation. At this stage, the offensive still had not been stopped by enemy fire. It was being suffocated by mathematics. Fuel consumption rates climbed as terrain worsened. Vehicles designed for efficiency on roads struggled in forests and snow. Each mile demanded more than predicted. Engines idled during delays. Traffic bottlenecks forced long waits. Every pause converted fuel into smoke. German maintenance officers reported growing deficits. More fuel was being consumed than captured. Tanks were operating on margins, measured in hours, not days. Commanders began consolidating remaining fuel, deciding which units would move and which would be abandoned. Mobility, once the core advantage of armored warfare, became selective privilege. Meanwhile, American operations displayed the opposite pattern. Fuel did not dictate decisions, it followed them. Units repositioned freely. Counterattacks were planned without concern for consumption limits. Supplies arrived by truck, by pipeline, and by air. Even surrounded formations received fuel deliveries larger than what German spearheads possessed at their peak. This disparity reshaped the battlefield psychologically. German soldiers began encountering scenes that shattered morale. American vehicles left running for warmth, fuel used for heating, cooking convenience, half-used supplies discarded. These were not acts of arrogance. They were habits formed by abundance. But to men counting liters, they carried a devastating message. The enemy was not conserving. The enemy did not need to. The war in that moment stopped feeling competitive. Tactical skill still mattered. Courage still mattered. But their influence shrank rapidly. A tank without fuel was not a weapon. A brilliant maneuver without supply was temporary theater. Every German success now increased exposure, lengthened supply lines, and deepened dependence on an enemy capable of denying everything. As fuel shortages intensified, decisions grew harsher. Vehicles were abandoned intact. Crews destroyed their own machines to prevent capture. Retreat routes were weighed against remaining fuel, often rejected as impossible. Men walked away from equipment worth fortunes because there was no gasoline to move it. By the time German commanders gathered to assess the situation, the truth could no longer be avoided. The offensive had uncovered something it was never meant to reveal. Not a weakness in American defenses, but the impossibility of fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity turned scarcity into irrelevance. The captured fuel at the beginning had felt like winning the lottery. Now it looked like proof of futility. The battlefield still echoed with gunfire. Maps still showed arrows pointing west. But the war had already shifted into a different category. This was no longer a contest of armies. It was a demonstration of scale. One side fought with machines that had to be protected from movement. The other fought with machines backed by systems so vast they could erase resources rather than defend them. Act 3 ends not with defeat, but with recognition. Recognition that the outcome no longer depended on bravery or planning. It depended on numbers that could not be changed in the field. What followed would not reverse that reality. It would only make it undeniable. Once recognition set in, the nature of German decision-making changed completely. The offensive no longer revolved around objectives or breakthroughs. It revolved around survival within shrinking limits. Fuel became a centralized asset pooled and rationed at the highest level. Leaders stopped asking where to attack and began asking which units were still allowed to move. Mobility, the very essence of armored warfare, turned into a privilege granted to a few formations at the expense of the rest. This was the moment when German armor ceased to function as a coordinated force. Tanks that had been designed to maneuver, exploit gaps, and respond quickly were now tied to static positions, not by enemy fire but by empty gauges. Units advanced unevenly, some still moving, others frozen in place. Coordination broke down. Timetables collapsed. Plans that assumed synchronized movement became impossible to execute. As fuel tightened further, German commanders faced a series of impossible choices. Should fuel be used to press forward in hopes of capturing another depot, or conserved to ensure a retreat route remained open? Should it be spent keeping tanks operational or reserved for transport vehicles evacuating wounded and essential personnel? Each decision traded immediate capability for long-term survival. There were no good answers, only delays. On the battlefield, this paralysis was visible. German vehicles began to cluster around limited fuel sources. Engines were shut down for hours at a time. Crews waited in silence, conserving every possible drop. When contact with the enemy occurred, engagements were shorter and more cautious, not because of fear of losses, but because movement itself carried cost. The German army was fighting while immobile, a contradiction that stripped armor of its purpose. Meanwhile, American forces exploited freedom of movement without even acknowledging it as an advantage. Units repositioned, reinforced, and counterattacked at will. Fuel did not constrain timing. If a maneuver failed, it could be attempted again elsewhere. If a unit stalled, it was reinforced rather than abandoned. This flexibility allowed American commanders to absorb setbacks without consequence, while German commanders treated every delay as potentially fatal. The contrast grew sharper as weather improved. When skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned in overwhelming numbers. German columns, already short on fuel, now faced attacks that further disrupted movement and destroyed transport. Any remaining fuel convoys became prime targets. Losses that might once have been manageable now became decisive. A destroyed fuel truck meant dozens of vehicles would never move again. As days passed, abandonment replaced maneuver. Tanks were parked deliberately, not hidden for ambush, but surrendered to immobility. Crews stripped essential equipment and prepared demolition charges. Machines that had required years of industrial effort to produce were destroyed in minutes because there was no fuel to justify their existence. The battlefield filled with intact weapons rendered useless by absence. Psychologically, this collapse was devastating. German soldiers were trained to endure hardship, to fight against odds, to adapt tactically. But scarcity on this scale removed agency. No amount of discipline could make fuel appear. No amount of bravery could push a tank forward without gasoline. Men began to understand that personal effort no longer influenced outcomes. The war was no longer something they could fight their way out of. Reports sent up the chain of command reflected growing resignation. Fuel shortages were no longer described as temporary or situational. They were labeled critical, then terminal. Units reported precise remaining distances they could travel before stopping forever. Operations were planned in kilometers rather than objectives. Commanders began writing reports that sounded less like battle updates and more like countdowns. At the same time, intelligence intercepted American communications that confirmed the imbalance. Fuel deliveries continued uninterrupted. Reserves increased even during heavy fighting. Surrounded American units received fuel by air in quantities larger than German spearheads possessed. This knowledge spread quietly but relentlessly. Each confirmation stripped away another layer of denial. The offensive, once imagined as a decisive stroke, had become an exposure event. It revealed to everyone involved what had been hidden behind years of propaganda and selective victories. Germany was not losing because of mistakes made during the offensive. It was losing because the material foundations of modern warfare were no longer in its favor. Ardennes did not create this reality. It illuminated it. By now, the battlefield told two stories at once. On maps, arrows still pointed west and orders still referenced objectives. On the ground, movement slowed, then stopped. Vehicles lined roads, empty and silent. Crews marched on foot past machines that should have defined dominance. The symbols of power remained, but the power itself was gone. Act 4 marks the transition from struggle to inevitability. Not defeat in the traditional sense, but acceptance that outcomes were no longer flexible. The war had crossed a threshold where effort could not compensate for imbalance. From this point forward, every German action would be reactive, constrained, and diminishing. The Americans, by contrast, would continue to operate as if the war were a problem of coordination, not survival. What remained was not a question of whether the offensive would fail, but how visibly the failure would unfold. The final acts would not introduce new factors. They would simply reveal in increasingly stark terms what scarcity looks like when it collides with abundance on an industrial scale. The collapse did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It unfolded quietly, kilometer by kilometer, vehicle by vehicle. By now, German units were no longer advancing toward objectives. They were drifting forward on inertia, sustained only by the momentum of earlier decisions. Fuel reserves were consolidated again and again, each time into fewer hands. Movement became episodic. A short push here, a brief reposition there. Then, silence. German commanders began making decisions that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Tanks were abandoned, not because they were damaged, but because moving them would strand something else. Half-tracks were drained to keep command vehicles running. Fuel intended for combat was diverted to evacuate wounded or key staff. The battlefield turned into a grim marketplace where every gallon had to justify its existence. When American pressure increased, the imbalance became lethal. Counterattacks did not need brilliance. They needed mobility. American units maneuvered around stalled German formations, cutting off roads, isolating pockets, forcing choices that scarcity made impossible. A German unit could still fight. It simply could not reposition, and a force that cannot move can only be defeated at a time of the enemy's choosing. Air power returned as weather cleared, sealing the outcome. German columns that might once have slipped away now sat exposed. Any attempt to move fuel convoys drew immediate attention. Each destroyed truck multiplied failure far beyond its physical loss. One vehicle lost meant dozens more immobilized. The system collapsed inward. Morale followed logistics. German soldiers did not panic. They understood. They saw intact machines left behind. They watched comrades march on foot past weapons that symbolized everything they had been trained to trust. The message was unmistakable: this war could no longer be influenced by effort. It could only be endured. American behavior reinforced that realization daily. Fuel continued to arrive in quantities that defied German comprehension. Surrounded units received deliveries by air. Engineers burned vast stockpiles to deny capture without hesitation. American commanders spoke of fuel in terms of flow, not preservation. It was something to be managed, not protected. By this stage, German command reports stopped predicting success. They described constraints: remaining operational range, remaining hours of movement, remaining options. The language of possibility was replaced by the language of limits. Retreat itself became conditional. Some units could withdraw, others could not. Those without fuel prepared to destroy their equipment and walk. The offensive no longer needed to be defeated. It was dissolving. The machines remained. The men remained. What was gone was the invisible foundation that made modern warfare possible. Without it, tanks were steel boxes, trucks were obstacles, roads led nowhere. The final realization spread through the ranks without orders or speeches. The enemy was not winning because of better tactics in the Ardennes. The enemy was winning because the war had moved beyond the scale Germany could operate within. Every captured depot, every burned reserve, every intercepted report confirmed the same truth. This was not a contest of wills. It was a mismatch of systems. By the time German forces prepared to disengage, the decision was no longer strategic. It was mechanical. Units moved until fuel ended. Then they stopped. What followed was destruction, abandonment, and withdrawal on foot. Not because of defeat in battle, but because motion itself had become impossible. Act 5 is where collapse becomes visible, not in explosions or surrender, but in stillness. Vehicles frozen in place, plans reduced to distances measured in kilometers. A modern army stripped of its defining advantage, watching an enemy for whom movement was never in question. The final act would not change the outcome. It would explain it. It would show how this moment born in fuel depots and supply tables reshaped how wars would be understood forever. What ended the offensive was not encirclement, not a decisive battle, and not the collapse of command. It was exhaustion without defeat. German units still had weapons. They still had trained crews. They still had the will to fight. What they no longer had was motion. Tanks sat intact with empty fuel gauges. Half-tracks were parked neatly along roadsides. Vehicles that symbolized power became immovable evidence of a war already decided. As German forces withdrew, often on foot, the contrast with the enemy became impossible to ignore. American units did not celebrate victory by counting captured equipment. They cataloged it, salvaged it, and moved on. For them, the abandoned machines were not trophies. They were logistical problems to be solved in hours. Fuel to recover them was requested locally, approved casually, and delivered without urgency. What had been impossible for one side was routine for the other. The deeper meaning of the Ardennes was now clear. This was not the moment Germany lost because it made a bad plan. It was the moment Germany realized that planning itself had lost relevance. No strategy could bridge the gap between scarcity and abundance. No tactical brilliance could compensate for an enemy whose production, transportation, and supply operated on a different order of magnitude. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond the battlefield. German soldiers spoke less about American firepower and more about American waste. Half-used rations discarded. Engines left running for warmth. fuel burned deliberately to deny capture. These were not acts of cruelty. They were habits of a system so large it no longer needed to fear loss. For soldiers trained to conserve everything, this casual abundance shattered morale more effectively than artillery. Reports carried this understanding back through the chain of command. Officers no longer described American strength in terms of divisions or weapons. They described it in terms of flow, continuous supply, continuous replacement, continuous movement. The enemy could afford mistakes. Germany could not afford pauses. That asymmetry defined the remainder of the war. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated across the front. German units surrendered not because they were surrounded, but because they were immobile. Entire formations remained operational on paper while being irrelevant in reality. Without fuel, they could not maneuver, retreat, or redeploy. They existed, but they could not act. Modern warfare punished immobility without mercy. For American commanders, the Ardennes reinforced a lesson already understood. Wars between industrial powers are not decided by moments of courage alone. They are decided by systems that function regardless of individual brilliance. Pipelines mattered more than speeches. Truck fleets mattered more than medals. Refineries mattered more than heroics. The battlefield was simply where these systems revealed their results. In hindsight, the captured fuel depot that once felt miraculous was the worst possible discovery for the Germans. It did not save them. It educated them. It forced a direct comparison between what Germany needed to survive and what America could afford to destroy. From that moment on, every hope of reversal was replaced by clarity. The Ardennes was not the end of the war in Europe, but it was the end of illusion. It exposed the final truth of industrial warfare. When one side can measure resources in oceans and the other in containers, the outcome is no longer competitive. It is procedural. After the fighting ended, abandoned tanks remained where they stopped, silent markers of that realization. Visitors would later ask why such powerful machines were left behind. The answer was simple: they did not run out of ammunition. They did not lose crews. They ran out of fuel, and fuel in this war was destiny. This is why the war did not end when Germany lost a battle. It ended when Germany discovered the scale of what it was up against, when it realized that even perfect execution could not overcome infinite supply, when it understood that abundance itself had become a weapon. The Ardennes did not just decide an offensive. It rewrote how wars would be understood. From that point forward, victory belonged not to those who fought hardest, but to those who could sustain movement indefinitely. Factories replaced fortresses. Logistics replaced legend. And the outcome was decided long before the first tank ever moved. So, the real question is not why Germany failed in the Ardennes. The real question is, this once war becomes a contest of industrial scale, can courage ever change the result again?